afternoon, everyone who's in the Central Time Zone. This is Jay Drake Hamilton at Fresh Energy. It's so great to be speaking to you today. I am fresh back from the Paris Climate Summit, and I'm eager to talk to you about those results, what they mean for Minnesota, the Midwest, and the United States, and to take your questions. First, a short introduction to Fresh Energy. We are the only Midwestern independent organization working solely on energy and climate policies to advance economic opportunities, and I serve as the Science Policy Director. That means that I work on coal, carbon, and climate policies at the state and national level, and so we have been really looking forward to this International Climate Summit for some months now. I was delighted to have the ability to travel to Paris, and I'm here today to report to you on the major outcomes of what is become known as the Paris Agreement among 196 parties. And first off, I thought I would start with a refresher background for those who may not remember back to 1992, when the nations of the world met at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. And at that meeting, parties developed what is known as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's an international treaty that the U.S. has ratified, and again, it dates back to 1992. If you read that treaty, you'll find that its main objective is to, and I'll quote here, stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic, that means human-caused interference with the climate system. The parties to that treaty are sometimes referred to as COP parties. That just stands for parties to the convention, and they meet annually in different parts of the world. This meeting in Paris over the last 2 weeks was known as COP21 because it was the 21st meeting of the parties. When I arrived in Paris, I found that all parties I spoke with had come to Paris, all nations had come to Paris expecting to reach an agreement. There was a remarkably positive and constructive feel to the negotiations. And I'm going to move now to my first slide. What we got in Paris was a unanimous agreement among 196 nations, and countries committed to aiming to reach global peaking of global warming emissions as soon as possible, and as well to undertake rapid reductions thereafter in accordance with the best available science, so as to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. Thoughtful negotiations over 6 years created momentum going into Paris that resulted in 2 weeks of in-person deliberations, some of them bilateral, some of them multilateral, that were the most forward-thinking and optimistic set of meetings that longtime parties to the convention can remember. Some of the quotes that are coming out of this meeting include, "The future belongs to renewables. The Paris Agreement marks the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era." Another quote, "The shift from fossil fuels to a 100% renewable energy economy has already started." Numerous businesses around the world have noted that the Paris Agreement sends to them a strong and long overdue economic signal. Ultimately, 196 nations approved unanimously the historic Paris Agreement, and it marks a turning point, a fundamental shift in the world's approach to climate action. We saw in Paris that developed and developing countries are united. All of them are engaged as contributors with a unity of purpose. I'll go to my next slide now. In Paris, we saw clear direction emerging. Long-term goals and signals were established in the marketplace economic opportunities moving forward. The world announced that we are aiming to halt global warming as low as we can go, with a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, but better if we can get even lower, because even a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming above pre-industrial levels will have very bad impacts around the world. In addition, every 5 years, countries agreed that they will strengthen their climate actions. It is a legally binding international agreement with requirements for reporting, verification, and review, which is what you want, because you want to be sure that as countries promise things, they are delivering, and everyone knows what the other countries are delivering. And the result is that countries will be subject to a high level of international scrutiny. And my next slide, please. I wanted to set for you the scene that I encountered when I got to Paris, just so that you have a feel of who was involved and what it looked like. The meeting was held about 11 miles northeast of Paris in a suburb, a former airport that had been converted on a temporary basis to serve this conference. So nothing glamorous about the accommodations or the meeting rooms. In fact, it could get a little loud at times because there were, all told, about 40,000 participants, about 20,000 per week estimated for the 2-week conference. And of those people, they represented 196 nations. And what was also remarkable about this particular conference was that on the first day of the conference, there were at least 154 heads of state, so the equivalent of President Obama, from 154 nations present under the same roof at the same time. And they all gathered together for photo ops that you may have seen on the news, and they all gave speeches in support of climate action, every last one of those heads of state. In addition, for a several-day period, and this is remarkable, I think, as well in the history of these UN negotiations, there were 10 United States senators who were on site and holding press conferences, part of the bilateral negotiations, and talking to people at the conference. I'm very proud that from the Midwest, my own Senator Al Franken was part of that delegation. So that gives you a sense of how large this conference was. And I want to also bear in mind and thank the people of France, because remember, this conference started just a little more than 2 weeks after the Paris attacks. So imagine that. Imagine being a city under attack and ready to host the most significant climate conference of all time. And they did a wonderful job of it, and they did it with great confidence and great good spirit. So I thank them for that. Next slide, please. Here are a few bullet points to summarize the Paris Agreement that was reached on December 12th of this year. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn. So please jot down your questions in the chat box as you have them. We'll be taking questions at the end, and we'll group similar questions so that we can get to as many questions as possible. First of all, I'm very happy to say, because Fresh Energy is very much a science-based organization and data-driven, that you have the case where the Science Policy Director from Fresh Energy is seeing emerge an agreement with a very strong scientific base. The agreement sets a long-term goal to limit warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels and aims to keep warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. The nation's committed to pursuing efforts to keep temperature increases furthermore below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So to give you a sense of what that means for people who are more accustomed to Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius is about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and 1.5 degrees Celsius is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. The countries further aimed to peak global emissions in the near term and to reach net zero emissions in the second half of this century. And again, the optimal outcome identified by the parties is a limit of no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. The long-term goal is to achieve the net zero emissions in the second half of this century. Given that there was universal agreement to go as low as we can in emissions, practically that goal would have to be reached by 2070 or even by 2050, so in the early part of the second half of this century. And a reminder that the goal has been identified as really being functionally equivalent to the need to going to 100% renewable energy. The second point of shared agreement is shared responsibility. Of the 196 countries present, I think at last count 189 of those countries have shared with their peers their own national climate action plans, which are known as intended nationally determined contributions. So this is a bottom-up approach coming from the economies of each country, and it's a new approach to these international negotiations that was started a couple of years ago, and it seems to be working quite well. Those national commitments will then be administered domestically. The third point that's important to know, and this I'm going to fall a little bit into lingo here, is much of the discussion at Paris was about ambition. And by ambition at this conference, what they're referring to is deep carbon reductions at the scale of the problem. So parties agreed to ratchet up their ambition regularly, which is really important because of the 189 countries that so far have weighed in, if you tally up those commitments, they don't come near close enough to meeting the 2 degrees Celsius limit, much less the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. So in considering ratcheting up ambitions, the countries were acknowledging and did discuss the need to come back regularly and deepen the carbon reductions. What it looks like is this. Every 5 years, starting by 2020, countries are required to come to the table together and meet together to strengthen their climate actions so that the world is on a path toward meeting the long-term goal. Starting in 2020, every party must come, and this is a binding obligation, and ratchet up carbon reductions. The agreement also includes a process that included a new word for me. The process is called a global stock take. So think of it as taking stock of where we're at and where we need to go. The global stock take, according to this agreement, will start in a few years, in 2018. The first stock take in 2018 will address mitigations, actions to reduce carbon emissions. Every 5 years thereafter, there will be another stock take, and that will look at both mitigation as well as adaptation, how we're doing on adaptation, and finance, how we're doing at making sure that the poorer countries of the world have the resources they need to make this clean energy transition. The fourth point I wanted to emphasize is transparency, and this is very important in an international agreement where we need to make deep reductions and we need to know who's making the reductions and we need to be certain that they are happening. There's a common binding framework in the agreement for reporting of emissions reductions, and it binds countries to undergo independent expert review and to make sure that those commitments will actually be met. So in other words, these are provisions that are put in place to subject countries to international scrutiny. So we don't need to take anyone's word for it, and this was very important. Enforcement of the Paris Agreement contains several provisions to clarify how countries will be held accountable for meeting their individual climate commitments. The countries themselves set up a dual system regarding emissions and finance of enforcement. First, they set up an accountability mechanism that addresses those countries clearly intent on not complying. And second, they established a support system for countries that are working hard but are falling short for some reason of meeting their commitments. So a bifurcated system. The heart of the accountability mechanism that's built into the Paris Agreement is a set of binding provisions around reporting and verification, as well as mandatory participation in a public exposure platform. That means every country who's a party to this has to publicly take a look at what other countries are doing. And this provides the opportunity for something that is known as, believe it or not, naming and shaming. Experts in negotiation generally consider international peer pressure the most effective form of enforcement available for addressing domestic activities that, of course, are protected by national sovereignty, such as decisions on a nation's energy mix. So this set of provisions stands in contrast to agreements that regulate cross-border activities, such as trade agreements. It's different than that. All parties are expected to account for their carbon reduction contributions, so demonstrate it for independent verification and review by a technical review expert. All parties are required to undertake and communicate ambitious efforts with a view of achieving the purpose of this agreement. So not just anything will do, they have to demonstrate ambition. And each party shall participate, which in legal language means they will participate in multilateral consideration of progress. All of these enforcement provisions are legally binding. In the instance of the United States, it is likely that ratification would be secured by an executive agreement, which is an authority granted to our president in instances where the legal mechanisms were authorized under previously ratified treaties such as the 1992 treaties and or existing domestic legislation. We can talk about that in a bit, how the U.S. will meet its obligations. A fifth point of deliberations for the parties was money and financing. The agreement says that wealthy countries should continue to offer financial support to help poorer countries to do two things, both cut their emissions by making the transition or leapfrogging to clean energy, and secondly, to adapt to climate change and the losses and damages incurred by that. The long-term goals and limits in the agreement send strong signals that all finance, ultimately, public and private, in the world needs to shift to reflect the urgency of the climate crisis, and this is brand new. A signal is given with the Paris Agreement to financial and investment communities that investments need to shift from fossil fuels to clean energy investments. In fact, the big development banks are already starting to commit to this big shift. We have seen in the private sector and nonprofit sector successful divestment and investment movements that are moving forward. As well, huge numbers of private companies are making investments in clean energy. So that pathway has already been broken, and we're moving forward in that direction. Under the agreement, developing countries will mobilize per year at least $100 billion in finance, and the deliberations made it clear that that is a floor, that really we should aim higher than that. After 2025, the pool of potential contributors to this fund may expand beyond the developed nations to include those developing countries that have the means to help as well. So this is part of the universality of the agreement, that as they are able, countries will increase their contributions. The agreement also does something else that's new. It sets a balance between financing for mitigation of climate and financing for adaptation to climate change. That is, responding to the challenges of climate change impacts. In reality, what we're seeing that 20 countries so far, led by the United States and France, have already announced a doubling of clean energy research and development, which is part of what's needed. Now, stepping back, indeed, the much greater recognitions around the world of the economic benefits and economic opportunities of taking climate action were a big factor in reaching this turning point in Paris, including, for example, the roughly 80% decline in solar costs in the last 6 years and the roughly 60% declines in wind energy costs over the last 6 years. So in effect, the nations of the world are trying to catch up with where the market is going. And the idea is, especially for poorer countries, to be able to capture those economic opportunities and get clean energy in the ground as the prices are falling, so not fall behind the reality of where the technology is. Business commitments are also very critical in buttressing this climate action. 114 companies have now committed to using science-based targets to set their emissions goal. At Paris, and I was at this side event, India announced a new global solar alliance that's also joined by France and the U.S. with a goal of mobilizing $1 trillion in solar investments. Another example at the conference were Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and a host of other billionaires announcing their Breakthrough Energy Coalition. Some commentators have said that companies that have shareholders really need to be responsible now to climate action. The UN's own Ban Ki-moon said, in reflecting on this agreement, markets now have a clear signal to unleash the full force of human ingenuity. Ban Ki-moon called the agreement ambitious, credible, flexible, and durable. But he also said, the work starts tomorrow. So I think every responsible commenter on this agreement has closed by saying, this is setting the right market signals, announcing that this is a universal agreement by countries of the world, led by their heads of state, and now the real work begins at home to achieve those carbon reductions. Finally, I wanted to point to what the agreement says about loss and damage. So this was a very important point for small island nations, vulnerable nations who are already seeing impacts of climate change. And the agreement includes a section that recognizes that climate-related disasters have big tolls on those nations and people that have already begun. Human rights, including for indigenous peoples, gender rights, In a just transition for workers who are now in the fossil fuel section, a provision that was sought by labor unions, these items are all in the preamble to the Paris Agreement. In itself, that preamble is an historic document in its own right. The agreement, it was clear that nations should be guided by equity between developed countries and less developed countries, between North and South, and as well between finance for mitigation and finance for adaptation. I think I'll turn to my next slide, please. I wanted to say a few words about my own role at the negotiations. Of course, the vast number of those 40,000 people who were in Paris are not a part of the negotiating teams. Those negotiations happen by designees of each nation. But the UN allows observers to seek delegate status so that they can watch what's happening, and the UN sees this as a very important role for observers like Fresh Energy to be there, to be witness to what's happening, and to report back to their own home countries what is happening. So that was part of my role. I got accreditation through the Climate Action Network delegation. And the Climate Action Network is the world's largest organization of non-governmental organizations that are working to push their governments forward to stop the climate crisis. It's also known as CAN, stands for Climate Action Network, and it consists of 950 organizations in 110 countries. We work together on the international treaty and share information about where our respective national delegations stand on negotiating points and how best to move the world forward together. So I was part of that CAN delegation. The first day of the summit, I worked with other board members of the U.S. node of the Climate Action Network in a press conference reacting to President Obama's remarks. So this was the first Monday of the conference. Here you see our press conference panel on your screen. And we had about 40 minutes to assemble our thoughts and react after President Obama addressed the group before it was our time for our press conference. So we were happy to do that. And in particular, I was drawing in my comments on Minnesota evidence for cost-effective carbon reductions. We'll go to my next slide here to give you one example of what I talked about. For example, Minnesota policy has just in the last year, and you're looking at pie charts for 2004 and 2014, by virtue of energy efficiency and renewable energy standards, has driven economic, cost-effective carbon reductions while really ramping down our reliance on coal. You see that reliance going from 67% to only 51% in just 10 years, and growth in the clean energy economy. And so you're seeing the renewable energy share increase dramatically in only 10 years. And I think this is striking for a lot of people, not only in Minnesota but other parts of the country and world, to see how much is possible driven by policy in a very short period of time. I'm also happy to report that the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development has also done a survey, which they're about to update, of how many clean energy jobs there are in Minnesota, and there are at least 15,300 clean energy jobs. So policies that Minnesota initiated have borne great fruit in terms of carbon reduction, although I must tell you that those policies were put in place to take advantage of clean energy job opportunities, and they have the co-benefit, a very big co-benefit, of cost-effective carbon reductions. The next slide will show you another example I used demonstrating, and remember, Minnesota is in a historically coal-dependent part of the country. We have cold winters and hot summers. We drive a lot, and so we need to use a lot of energy. We are not like some of the more liberal and progressive states on the coast. We are in part of the manufacturing heartland of this country. So it's very instructive when our biggest utility, Xcel Energy Minnesota, makes a commitment, as Xcel did in October of this year, that will lead them to achieving 60% carbon reductions by the year 2030. And this is a set of pie charts that Xcel created to show you that change, so that by 2030, Xcel Minnesota would only be 15% dependent on coal. So again, big changes that are possible because of leadership decisions driven by the good economics of clean energy and the relatively poor economics of coal energy. And we did this to demonstrate to the rest of the world that it is including states in the manufacturing heartland of this country, that climate action is happening and is being proved out by economic opportunities that it is generating. And my next slide shows you another piece of work that I was involved in at the Climate Summit. The U.S. Climate Action Network, so the U.S. node of CAN, asked the U.S. negotiating team for a meeting. And this meeting happened late in the second week, so in the thick of negotiations. And you're looking at a screenshot that was taken from an ABC News show that shows you an image from that meeting. And you'll see at the table, you'll see me on the far end. And the reason I'm looking like I'm trying really hard to hear what's happening is that Secretary Kerry has turned to address the other end of the table. And remember, we're in a makeshift kind of conference center. And behind our particle board wall, there's a hubbub going on at the moment. So I'm trying hard to hear. But I was delighted to be in the room with Secretary John Kerry, and all of his staff were reporting that he was there for the entire last week of the negotiations. I don't think he slept or ate much at all. He was deeply involved in bilateral negotiations and in multilateral negotiations, and his whole team was a big part of the success in Paris. Directly across from Secretary Kerry, turned away from us, is Todd Stern, who's the lead U.S. negotiator on climate change, so he's been intimately involved in this work for years. And then seated two people to the left of Secretary Kerry is Brian Deese, who is President Obama's special advisor on climate change and plays a very intimate daily role in these negotiations and in all of the work leading up to those negotiations. So I wanted to give you a sense that we weren't just in Paris, that we were at the table. We were meeting and pressing our lead U.S. negotiators for greater action and more ambition, and I think we were very successful in that going forward. I wanted to lay out for you what I think the factors were in making for what I think is a real strong turning point that happened in Paris. First of all, these meetings don't just happen in 2 weeks and everything gets done in 2 weeks. There was about 6 years of work leading up to the Paris Agreement. So a lot of the hard work was done in meetings that happened in Bonn and Warsaw and other places with the parties, a great deal of work to get us to this place. And Paris was really the result of a number of rounds of thoughtful diplomacy, including great work not only by the Obama administration and the Environmental Protection Agency, which is using the Clean Air Act to develop our own national commitments. And you may well ask, Jay, what are the U.S.'s national commitments as part of this agreement? And they are to double fuel economy standards to 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025, cutting carbon in half. And that is now U.S. law. So we're bringing to the table something that we are sure that we can do. And secondly, the Clean Power Plan under the Clean Air Act that places first ever limits on carbon pollution from coal plants. That too is now federal law, and so we have the ability to do that and meet U.S. obligations based on laws that we have passed. Together, our commitment represents a reduction of emissions in the U.S. by 26% from 2005 levels by 2025. As well, President Obama and President Xi of China 13 months ago reached an historic bilateral agreement leading up to Paris, and that brought the Chinese to the table in Paris in a very productive way. And President Obama continued bilateral discussions with India, Brazil, France, and many other nations throughout the climate talks. So he wasn't just there for the first 2 days. He was also on the phone and doing bilateral negotiations that way. I want to thank, too, the leadership of the government of France, that they led a process that was considered very fair, very productive, and people who are real veterans of these processes had never seen the likes of it before. Routinely, these French negotiators would stand up and get standing ovations for their work, which is highly unusual in international matters. Other items of work that bore fruit in Paris were that announced in Paris was a compact of mayors where over 400 of the world's cities, including my own city of St. Paul, agreed to set targets that would cut urban emissions of carbon in half. Another crucial commitment that was developed and reported in Paris is more rural in nature, and that is that 127 million hectares of degraded land in Africa and Latin America are to be restored. The engagement of heads of states from the very beginning of these climate talks right through to the end 2 weeks later has not only led to success, but I think in some ways seems to have put U.S. opponents of climate action on the defensive, because this is leadership that we have never seen before in the U.S. and in the world. The business involvement coming from Minnesota-based companies has been very critical for engagement, and that includes not only the work of Xcel Energy here in Minnesota, but also leadership in urging an ambitious climate treaty from Target, Best Buy, General Mills, and Cargill. They've been joined by businesses from around the globe, together with investors in cities and states, who are urging an appropriately ambitious international agreement. States like Minnesota, who have been achieving carbon reductions while growing the economy, have proved that the coal-dependent heartland of this country is a place where also the transition to clean energy has begun. And I want to end in summarizing what led to the momentum and created the ability to create this turning point by really highlighting agriculture's involvement, especially coming from a state of Minnesota. We saw that General Mills brought to Paris producers, farmers from an array of, I believe, half a dozen states across the heartland. And they hosted an event, a joint event at which Agricultural Secretary Tom Vilsack spoke, very successful, talking about two sets of things, talking about the climate changes that they're witnessing that are impacting their ability to produce food and feedstocks. And they also talked about the increased risk to their business enterprise from climate change. And so they were also asking for an ambitious climate agreement. Go to my next slide, please, Matt. I show you this next slide not just because I'm in it, but this was taken at the White House. The shot was taken at the White House on August 3rd of this year. If you are an energy geek, you know that August 3rd was the date where the president rolled out the Clean Power Plan. And of course he had a big event at the White House with about 300 people in the East Room of the White House, and I was there for that too. But I was fortunate enough, because of not my, but Minnesota as a whole's leadership on climate, to get invited to a small group meeting with the president before that big announcement. And when I walked into the room, I encountered the two gentlemen who were standing between me and the president. And I show you this image because I think it really encapsulates the movement leading up to Paris and the work that many smart negotiators did to bring together many different voices from many sectors who are eager for ambitious climate action at the scale of the problem. Standing to my right is Harold Wimmer, who's the executive director of the National American Lung Association. And his interest is that the Clean Air Act protects human health. The Clean Power Plan under the Clean Air Act will greatly improve human health prospects. And standing to Mr. Wimmer's right is Ben Folk. Ben is the CEO of Xcel Energy, which operates in 8 states. And so he actually runs my electric company, Xcel Energy, here in Minnesota, but serves many other customers across 8 states as well. Ben Folk and I were the only 2 Minnesotans in this group of 12 people meeting the president. I think the reason for that is that the president was eager to meet some of the people from the heartland and outside the Beltway who've been taking actions to spur economic opportunities around climate action. And so I'm very proud of that. I'm going to turn now to my next slide and tell you what are the next steps. The Paris Agreement will become open for signatures as of April 22nd, that's Earth Day, also my birthday, April 22nd of 2016. And we believe that opening will happen in a ceremony either at the United Nations in New York or perhaps in Paris as a tribute to the work of Parisian and French negotiators. Ratification of the agreement will occur when at least 55 parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, who account for in total at least 55% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, have ratified. A success for this agreement is really strongly dependent on continued public information and public engagement. We need to think about the local actions at the policy and legal level that need to happen to ensure we get deep reductions at the scale of this problem. We now have a process, thanks to Paris, that builds on momentum from many different sectors that can accelerate actions. Countries have now gone home and are assessing what the agreement means for their national plans. There's a signal that we are in and that we are going to start the national process to enforce in our own country. What's interesting, I think, is that the excuse that sometimes gets used, that other countries are not acting, can now, I think, definitively be taken off the table. 196 countries have acted in unison. However, deep national transitions need to occur. I think, for one thing, in the next couple of months at the World Economic Forum, we'll learn more about business commitments to respond and business reactions. Impacts on fossil fuel companies, I think, are pretty clear. Those companies now have a much clearer sense of the urgency and the pathway forward, and they will need to make a much more orderly transition to become service providers. We need to continue building on this momentum that's been generated. We need to ensure a strong and ambitious climate finance pathway so that this Paris Agreement will drive innovation and investment across the globe for years to come. A transformation as big as this will meet challenges all along the way. We need to accelerate both the pace and the scale of the shift to a low-carbon economy. The Paris Agreement signals the world's move to zero carbon, resilient growth. Both of those things. We're both going to mitigate and we are going to adapt to climate change. And we're going to help poorer countries do both things. To get to 1.5 degrees Celsius and no more warming, we are going to need to accelerate action starting now. Because we're nowhere near on the track yet to constrain temperatures to that level, we need to look at getting to zero emissions, as I said before, by as soon as 2050 or 2070, according to my examination of UNEP's emissions gap report, so that we can meet that goal. However, this is an ambitious, doable, durable, inclusive, and transparent climate agreement. In it, as of December 12, 2015, and I hope we always remember that date, the world has recognized that incremental change will not do the job. And together, nations of the world, I think, have shown themselves what's possible when the world stands as one. Now we need to demonstrate climate action at scale in every country, including ours, and hold ourselves and our nations accountable for those changes and making sure that they happen soon. I'm going to open it up in just a minute for questions. I know a number of questions have been coming in, and Matt Privratsky is going to moderate those questions and try to group them together for me. I just want to say, you'll see on your screen now a link if you'd like to become a donor to Fresh Energy. If you like what you've heard, if you like the work that Fresh Energy does, it's getting to be the end of the year, and we would welcome having you as a member and donor to Fresh Energy, so please consider that. And I'm really looking forward to your questions. So Matt, would you start us off?
Thanks, Jay. Great job. We have a few questions that came in related to the timing of the agreement or the idea that maybe this wasn't enough or how much this agreement will do. Are there any specific things that you're looking for as we move forward now that the agreement is placed, or any things that need to be addressed as this gets implemented?
Yeah, there will be a number of considerations. So first of all, there is, people can read this agreement online, and some people may want to do that. I know that it will be subject to lots of academic and peer-reviewed analysis going forward to determine what exactly is needed from which parts of the world, and I look forward to seeing those analyses. For the U.S., I know that meeting our mitigation objectives is possible with the existing domestic laws that I just described, and that these laws in turn can also evolve over time and get stronger as needed. We also know in the U.S. that we can legally enter into this agreement without having Congress take a vote through the executive agreement that I mentioned. And I want to just give you a sense of how big the U.S. commitment is so far. The fuel economy standards that will double by 2025 will reduce U.S. emissions by an estimated 320 million tons a year by 2025. So when you're thinking about a big problem like climate change, you better be ratcheting up in a big way, and that's one big example. The Clean Power Plan that I mentioned that is more recent will produce an estimated 240 million tons a year of carbon reduction by 2025, and that number is expected to double by 2030. So these big changes are being made, but it's interesting because the analysis that have been done of the Clean Power Plan shows that Minnesota is already on that trajectory, and that we know what works in Minnesota, and we're hoping to share that information with other states and work with other states to achieve those reductions.
A few other questions related to the idea of incentives and driving that innovation. What does the agreement offer in terms of incentives for people to take action as sort of a carrot for that action?
Thanks. That's a really good question. Because this is a bottom-up developed agreement, nations were bringing their own climate action plans. So in many ways, nations have a lot of flexibility to determine how they are going to incentivize those changes. So different countries will pursue different actions. Some countries may decide to work together. I know some people have asked, what about a price on carbon? And this UN process was never on a path to try to generate an agreed-upon universal price on carbon. However, it's certainly laid in place, and if you look at the agreement, you will see there are places where it says how you would work on having countries work together to share credit for carbon reductions, and especially to make sure that there's no double counting that occurs. So, for example, if one country is counting a carbon reduction, that another country can't claim that same reduction. That's a very real possibility, and the agreement presupposes that that might happen and has started to put constructive elements in place to make sure that that does not happen.
And Jay, there's a few questions about the actual reporting and analysis that takes place moving forward and how people report their actual progress. Can you speak a little bit more to how people will be reporting their progress as we move forward?
Yeah, and the agreement sets out essentially a committee, I don't know if they use that word, a committee of nations, of parties that will develop the framework for that to happen, but it's clear that the process will need to include daylighting, what are called daylighting provisions that require that countries report their actions in an accurate, consistent way that's consistent with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and how they record and track emissions. The participation provisions ensure that enough peers are invested in holding bad faith actors accountable to create pressure to comply. And those peer accountability provisions create a system in which countries are publicly evaluated and analyzed by their peers. So this was especially important, I know, to the U.S. and EU delegations. They were, and they made this clear to China in particular, that, it's a new day and a new world, and we need to be sure that when we're talking about countries that have been less open about all kinds of information, that for this thing, we really need to know when and where those carbon reductions are occurring. We need to be certain that they're occurring. The kind of stock taking that I described and this every 5-year ratcheting up of ambition means that we need to know how we're doing as a world, and we need to actually be able to accurately verify where we are on that pathway. We know we need to go farther and faster and deeper than we are now, and we're going to need to keep fine-tuning that and amplifying our ambition all along the course of this action. The Paris Agreement does not solve this problem by any stretch of the imagination, but every delegation I talked to was certain that the Paris Agreement puts in place a framework that allows us to ratchet up our ambition and solve this problem.
Another piece that several participants are asking about is how it will be impacted by any future administration or members in Congress, and you spoke to the idea that this is already able to be ratified based on previous actions that have been taken. Can you address the questions of when there's a new president or what Congress wants to act on, how that might impact the agreement?
Thank you much, Matt, and thanks for that question. And yes, of course, it's very important. We're certainly in a presidential election cycle. Right now, we the president has the ability to make this decision without congressional action. It is possible that a future Congress will want to take action, so we'll need to look at what authorities are there. However, here is the way I think that the world has changed in Paris. And I think partly the fact that we're hearing utter silence last night in the GOP debate on this issue is a signal that some parties aren't prepared to take this on when 154 heads of state and 196 nations, including nations that were considered going into the Paris Treaty negotiations pretty fractious and maybe unwilling to join together, states like India and China, that people have been proved wrong, that the world really has changed. And I think deep down the reason the world has changed is that two lines of evidence are becoming really clear. People are now feeling the impacts of climate change. And in really important sectors of countries across the globe, including agriculture, forestry, and all kinds of natural resource-dependent industries, including tourism, people are feeling the hit of climate change and are worried about the risk to their business. So it's a business kind of proposition. Secondly, there's a new draw and allure as these clean energy technologies, especially solar and wind, are coming down in price so rapidly as those industries are scaling up. And that gives people new hope and new ambition for wanting to tap into that part of the clean energy economy. I think one of the most interesting parts of the negotiation was nations hearing from less developed countries, many of whom do not have electricity now, making the case that not only are they being impacted by climate change now and suffering losses, but they do not want to go through our notably a bad decision in retrospect to become so dependent on fossil fuels, that they would like to leapfrog over fossil fuels and get clean energy in the ground, and many of them will need some help to do so. So that is why the finance mechanisms have really been built up in this negotiation. I'm looking at a question now, Matt. Somebody asked rightly, so is there any weakness in the agreement? What could have been better? And certainly there are weaknesses in any agreement. I think a big one here is that this was an agreement that was put together by nations. So sometimes we think about climate change, and I do myself, based on sector-by-sector approach. And this is based on a nation-by-nation approach. And it left out two important sectors, so international aviation and shipping, which are sources of greenhouse gas emissions that are not covered by this agreement. So that will need to be dealt with going forward, because you can't deal with global emissions without looking at the whole panoply of emissions going forward. I think, in my mind, what could have been better is if this agreement happened 20 years ago. I know I was studying in college around that time, and it was really clear in the science that we needed to make these adjustments sooner rather than later. So it's to our detriment that we didn't come as a set of nations to this conclusion 20 years earlier, but now we have. And I think in the history of turning points, what we may see bear out in this case is the nations of the world agreeing in unity to work for deep reductions, acknowledging that what they put on the table so far is not nearly enough, and that they need to ratchet up their ambition. But starting to see that they are chasing clean energy opportunities that are getting more and more affordable, and wanting to figure out a way for the world to transition away from fossil fuels to those renewable energy technologies sooner rather than later.
And there's a couple questions related to how people might be able to find further analysis or other analysis of the agreement moving forward. What might be a few good sources for them, Jay?
Well, thank you very much. And I know somebody asked me just yesterday, they were looking for a 1 or 2 page summary. And I would like to see that too. I don't think that's likely ever to arise. But I know a number of great think tanks around the nation and in the world are now taking a close look at the agreement, crunching numbers, and coming out with analyses. I think we'll start seeing some of those as soon as the end of this week. But it's not a hurry up and get it done process. We want to do it well. What I will commit to doing, and I put up my Twitter handle there as well as my email address, I will tweet out and I will email out regularly as I see particularly useful analyses that come out, so that if you'd like, you can take a look at those things. I joined Twitter just before the climate agreement. I think I was the last person on Earth, probably outside of China. And it was a great opportunity. It was a great platform to use in Paris, and I intend to use it going forward. So please follow me on Twitter if you're involved in that social media as well. But if you have additional questions that we don't get to today, please don't hesitate to email me with those questions going forward. And also, Fresh Energy, we're already signed up to give, I think, 6 different presentations around the state of Minnesota just in the next couple of months, both on this climate agreement and what it means for efforts that are already ongoing in Minnesota and this nation, and how one plays off the other, and how we can all move forward together more quickly. So please request a presentation in more depth on a particular issue if you'd like that as well. I think we can have time for maybe a couple more questions, Matt.
We have a couple that are speaking specifically to the idea of developing countries versus developed countries and how they might be impacted differently, or how they might interact with each other. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, thank you, and that's a very good question. In previous rounds of international climate negotiations, there has been the use of a term that's called differentiation. So differentiating between more developed countries and less developed countries, and having different sets of expectations on those countries. This was an agreement where the process and the countries decided it was time to move beyond that we needed an agreement where every country on Earth was actually moving forward on climate action and carbon reduction. Very early in this process, it was fascinating to see. This was in the first week of a 2-week process. In the first day, I think, some of the less developed small island nations got together, and they decided they were going to set for themselves a goal of 0 emissions and 100% renewable energy. And they did it because they wanted to say, we're not just waiting for you richer countries to take action. We know that we need this as well. And I think that actually helped spur action. I've actually heard several commentators say that this was the Conference of Parties that was really led by small nations. And that's really appropriate, because in many cases, these small nations, the poorer among them, are much more vulnerable, and their people are already being impacted by climate change. So it's very useful to be hearing from those folks and seeing them come to the table with great analyses of their own of what they're up against, and working constructively with richer countries to diversify those funding transfers to make sure that they are able to complete the clean energy transition that we have already started.
And Jay, one last question. There's a few right at the end here asking, what are some of the biggest things that local governments can do within their scope and influence? Obviously, this being a global agreement, there's going to be so many different scales that action is taken, but what are some things that local governments can do?
Thank you, and that's a really good question. There was a separate but parallel process that was happening in Paris with mayors. I mentioned the 400-plus mayors, including my own mayor, Chris Coleman from St. Paul, but many others, 2 others just from Minnesota, taking a look at what they can do. And they were looking at it. One of the interesting things about climate change is most of the mitigation for climate change happens in energy and changing the way we use energy, but most of the impacts of climate change actually boil down to water. And so these were cities in Minnesota that are along the Mississippi River, and they were looking at discussing the 20 million people a day who draw their drinking water from the Mississippi and how that will be impacted by climate change. So that is what motivated them. So some cities will be looking at adaptation, and they'll be doing it in 2 parts. Things that that they know they need to adapt to because the changes are already occurring. But more importantly, smarter cities are thinking about, my goodness, we can't always and perpetually be adapting without also mitigating. And so those 2 go hand in hand. There was a very clear communication signal going to negotiators in Paris that it is cities and local communities who are leading the way and demonstrating what can be done. And many different types of cities and sizes of cities were present in Paris and talking about that. The one caution I would give is to make sure that we know that things don't end in any particular city, that we can't just take care of our own backyard, but we need to show how it can demonstrate and impel action in other parts of the economy and other parts of the world.
And Jay, you spoke to these a little bit, especially with agriculture, but how did industries but also just the general area of forest protection and reforestation and agriculture, how did those come up when you were over there in negotiations, and did you hear that as kind of part of the discussion and part of the solution?
Yes, and honestly, I was less involved in those parts of the negotiation, but clearly land use and what we do with our forests and cutting them down or not, keeping them healthy, amounts to about 19% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a very big component of what's going forward. In terms of land use and agriculture, it was very instrumental to note that in the first weekend of the conference, there was a very historic commentary that was published in the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, jointly authored by Senator Al Franken, who at the time was at the Paris conference, and by the CEO of Cargill, Dave McLennan. And the title of that, you should read it if you haven't yet, is Our Food Supply is Reason Enough to Act on Climate Change. So historic actors who don't usually write together are getting published, and it's part of the momentum going forward. I've included discussion of some of the more on-the-ground details of what we did in Paris in my blog that you can find on Fresh Energy's website. So please take a look at that if you want a little bit more color about what was going on, including the Fossil of the Day Award and other fun things that were happening at the conference. And I think Matt has a few final words, but before he gets on, I just want to thank everyone for perhaps taking their lunch hour to join me today. This is part of history. Please tell your kids that. And please tell your kids that we're not just, checking that box off, that we're going to be moving forward, but now we know we're doing it with 195 other countries in the world. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for everyone for joining us, and just a reminder that these slides have been recorded, and we will be posting them to that same blog that Jay mentioned, and we'll also be, obviously Jay will be tweeting them out, and the Fresh Energy accounts will be posting them as well. So keep an eye out for those, and thanks again for joining us.